Week 4 of the fantasy football season. Here's the top 36 wide receivers. I'm ranking this week number 1, Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams. So what a monster year it's been so far for Puka Nacua. Seems like he gets these quiet 25, 30-point fantasy days to begin the season. And this week in a pretty decent matchup with the Colts coming to town and the high-powered offense of the Los Angeles Rams, where him and Matthew Stafford are locked in. Puka Nacua, I think, goes out there once again, has a big game. Number 2, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. St. Brown last week, a nice game again. 2 weeks in a row, he's put good games together, 7 for 77 and a touchdown. And this week, I know Denzel Ward, he's most likely going to get on him majority of this game, but Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's matchup proof, one of the best receivers in the league over the last 3 seasons. And this week versus Cleveland, I think he goes out there and has another good game. Number 3, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. So maybe I'm higher on Jefferson than other people. I know so far the numbers haven't been up to par, obviously, for Justin Jefferson, his standards, and where he was drafted mid-first round in most fantasy drafts. And this week at Pittsburgh, it looks like Jalen Ramsey is going to get Jefferson in this matchup. But I think Justin Jefferson has a better chance to start putting up more points now with Carson Wentz in their quarterback. Last week, that game was over from the get-go. He had 5 catches, 75 yards, was Jefferson. And this week, versus the Pittsburgh Steelers, I think Jefferson goes out there, has a big game though for Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks. So JSN weekly, he's finding the end zone, and he's already put up some big games as JSN, where 18 or more fantasy points in PPR leagues the first 3 weeks of the season. And last week, another easy one for him, 5 for 96 and a touchdown. And this week in a matchup, at a leaky secondary of the Arizona Cardinals, even though the defense has held their own for the most part so far this year. I like him as a top 5 option. Number 5, Ja'Marr Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. So Chase, we know the numbers are going to take a hit, obviously, with Jake Browning in there as a quarterback, but Chase still one of the best, if not the best receivers in the league. I think he's going to overcome it more weeks than not. But this week, definitely a tough matchup where Patrick Surtain most likely is going to be covering the whole game, where obviously he's one of the better corners in the league. But like I said, Chase is a solid wide receiver and someone that more weeks than not still going to come out with big numbers. Number 6, Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. So pretty much he's the only option in this passing game for Houston. I know Schultz had a couple grabs last week. Christian Kirk's back in the lineup, but Nico Collins, he does it all. Him and Stroud have been locked in over the last couple seasons since Stroud entered the league. And Nico Collins, he's a matchup problem for secondaries. And like I said, he's getting peppered with targets. He's a big-time playmaker. And this week in a good matchup versus the Tennessee Titans, I expect him to go out there and put up the numbers again. Number 7, Malik Neighbors of the New York Giants. And now with Jackson Dart in there, quarterback, Malik Neighbors, we'll see if his upside is going to be more. I just feel like him and Russell Wilson weren't on the same page. I know week 2 we had the monster game at the Cowboys, 9 for 167 and 2 touchdowns. But versus Washington, they were out of sync. He dropped a couple passes in that one in week 1. And then in week 3, I know he had McDuffie on him, one of the better corners in the league. But Wilson, he almost caused a major injury to Neighbors, throwing up a deep ball into the end zone where 2 defenders were near him, and he got laid out. Luckily, he came back into the game. So I think with the youngster Jackson Dart in there now, him and Neighbors, they're going to build up rapport. We saw Neighbors last season with a lot of no-name quarterbacks go out there and put up numbers. And this week, in a game where they're going to be trailing points early and often versus the Chargers, I think Neighbors bounces back. Number 8, Rome Odunze of the Chicago Bears. So he's been flying up the ranking board quickly in the first 3 weeks of the season, where he's got 4 touchdowns in the first 3 games. So Rome Odunze, the number 1 option easily in this offense. He's overtaken DJ Moore, in my opinion, for the Chicago Bear team. And him and Caleb Williams, they've been locked in ever since last season, where they both came into the league as rookies. So this week in a great matchup at the Vegas Raiders. Obviously, it wouldn't be surprising to me again if he finds the end zone. Number 9, Davante Adams of the Los Angeles Rams. So far, 2 good games out of the first 3 for Davante Adams with this Ram team. And I don't even think he reached full potential yet in this offense. He's getting peppered with targets. Him and Stafford still a little bit off, but he's got 2 touchdowns. Is Adams in the last 2 games. And this week in a ball game with the Indianapolis Colts coming to town in a potential high-scoring game, I think Adams once again has a good one. Number 10, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. So Brown, it was getting a little worrisome that he wasn't going to come around the numbers and he wasn't going to put up points. But last week, he was a man possessed out there, breaking a lot of tackles, big yard after catch plays. They came back from 3 scores with this Eagle team to beat the Los Angeles Rams. And I think this week, once again, we could see a track meet in Tampa Bay. And like I said, Hurts and Brown, they've been locked in for many seasons, and it was just a slow start for them. And now Brown, after the big game last week, I think he's back and ready to go. Number 11, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. I've said this many times, it doesn't matter the quarterback. Garrett Wilson, he's a playmaker, and he goes out there, makes plays, and gets open. And last week, a big game at Tampa Bay. This week could be a potential high-scoring game with two bad defenses going at it at the Miami Dolphins. And like I said, if it's Fields or Tyrod Taylor, he's still going to go out there and get his numbers more weeks than not. Number 12, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. So London, it's been a struggle for him, but obviously the problem's been Michael Penix, where he's holding on to the football too long. He's taking big hits, and him and London aren't on the same page. So it wouldn't be surprising to me if Kirk Cousins is back in the lineup sooner than later for this Atlanta Falcon team. When we saw last season, he had a big year. Was London 100 catches, over 1,200 yards. So this week versus Washington, I think they're going to try to force feed him to kickstart this passing game. Besides Bijan Robinson, the only guy doing anything. 13, Emeka Egbuka of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So now with Mike Evans out 3-4 weeks with the hamstring injury, Emeka Egbuka is going to step in as the number one guy in the passing game. And we know he's a good playmaker. He's made some big plays already in the first 3 weeks of his career. And I know Chris Godwin might come back, but he's obviously not going to be 100%. So this week in the matchup versus a good secondary, no doubt about it, the Philadelphia Eagles, I still think Egbuka goes out there, has a good performance, especially now that he's going to be the number one target in this offense. 14, Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. So Tyreek Hill, a lot of people wrote him off, and after week one, they especially wrote him off even more. But the last 2 weeks, he's gone out there and he's put up some fantasy points as Tyreek Hill. And this week, a good matchup versus the New York Jets coming to town on Monday night. I know Sauce Gardner, a lot of people think he's one of the better corners in the league. But so far this season, him and this whole secondary, they've been roasted week after week by wide receivers. So I think Tyreek Hill, he gets loose in this one, has another good game. 15, Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. So last week, a horrible game, no doubt. It was for Flowers. 2 catches, 13 yards in that one. He took a backseat to Mark Andrews, had a big game. And that's the thing we saw last season as well. If Zay Flowers had a big game, Mark Andrews didn't have a big game. And then if Mark Andrews has a big game, Zay Flowers don't. But this week at Kansas City, I think it's going to be all hands on deck. Lamar took a beating last week, taking a lot of sacks in that ball game versus the Detroit Lions. And he's got to make quicker decisions and get the football out more. And that's obviously success, getting the football to Zay Flowers. 16, Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers. So Ricky Pearsall, big game last week it was for him. This week, a good matchup with the Jacksonville Jaguars coming to town, where I don't think their defense is any good, where obviously now they're playing Travis Hunter at corner a little bit more than at the wide receiver position. This team, they are 2-1 coming into this week. Here's Jacksonville, but like I said, they really haven't versed any great teams as Jacksonville in the early going. So Ricky Pearsall, he's playing good football. Number one option in the offense right now is Ricky Pearsall, obviously, with George Kittle out of the lineup. And this week versus Jacksonville, I think the volume's going to be there. And also if Brock Purdy returns as well, that's great for him. Number 17, Tatora McMillan of the Carolina Panthers. So last week was a down game for McMillan. They got off to an early start, and then by the second half, they ran the clock out. But he's a talented wide receiver. Best receiver that came out in the NFL draft this season is McMillan. And this week, pretty good matchup at the New England Patriots, where they're bend but don't break defense, but still, we've seen wide receivers go out there and have some big games versus the Patriots so far this season. So I think McMillan goes out there, has a solid performance. 18, Keenan Allen of the Los Angeles Chargers. So this receiving room, very talented over there. And Allen in his season back after gone for one season where he got traded to the Bears, having a big season in the early going. Him and Herbert, they've been locked in for many seasons. ESP's been there. Obviously, the rapport's been there. And this week in an easy matchup at the New York Giants, I think Allen could find the end zone again. 19, George Pickens of the Dallas Cowboys. So now Pickens, he's going to be operating as number one receiver with CeeDee Lamb out a few weeks with the high ankle sprain. And Pickens 2 weeks in a row now, 6 catches, 69 yards, identical stats and a touchdown. So this week versus Green Bay, very tough matchup. One of the best, if not the best defenses in the league is this Green Bay Packer team. But like I said, Pickens, him and Jake Ferguson, pretty much the only two guys I believe are going to get peppered with targets, and maybe Jalen Tolbert a little bit here and there. But Pickens, he's a good playmaker. He can run the routes in a good deep ball threat. And this week in a game where they're going to be chasing point, I think he'll work his way into points. 20, Cortland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. So Sutton, week 2, he didn't do anything at the Indianapolis Colts. And then last week he had a monster ball game versus the Los Angeles Chargers, with Sutton over 100 yards and a touchdown. So this week on Monday night with a good matchup versus Cincinnati Bengals, a defense that can't stop anyone. I think Sutton goes out there once again, has a good game. 21, Ladd McConkey of the Los Angeles Chargers. So far he's off to a slow start, only one game with double-digit fantasy points in PPR league. And like I said, with Keenan Allen back over here this season in Los Angeles and Quentin Johnson emerging and being more consistent and better catching the football, we had drop problems last season. McConkey has definitely floated down the rankings, but still a talented wide receiver. Obviously, it's only one football to go around, and maybe this is the week McConkey breaks out at a bad Giant defense, especially in the secondary, and has a good game. 22, DK Metcalf of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Metcalf, he's been a touchdown-dependent wide receiver so far this season. And what you're going to expect out of Metcalf, I don't think a high ceiling, obviously, with the veteran 41-year-old Aaron Rodgers at quarterback, where they don't want him back there throwing the football 40, 45 times a game. And he's going to make more safe throws more times than not. So this week in a matchup versus Minnesota, where they shut down that Bengal offense and made them look like the worst offense in the league, creating all those turnovers and touchdowns in that game. I think Metcalf is still a good number 2 option for fantasy owners in their lineup. 23, Quentin Johnston, Los Angeles Chargers. Arguably the best receiving room in all the NFL is this Charger team. So Johnston, he's been a PPR machine, running all the routes, big playability, 2 touchdowns in week 1. Johnston had, and this week in a great matchup with the New York Giants. I think Johnston goes out there once again and produces wide receiver 2 numbers. 24, Deebo Samuel of the Washington Commanders. And now Terry McLaurin banged up with a quadricep injury. We don't know if he's going to miss week 4 or not for this Commander team. He's going to undergo more tests. And last week it was a down game for Deebo, but that bowl game was over early versus the Vegas Raiders. And also that was with Marcus Mariota in that quarterback. So like I said, if Jaden Daniels is back this game, and also if McLaurin misses time, Deebo's really going to move back up the rankings pretty quickly. And it's a good matchup this week in Atlanta. 25, Jacoby Myers of the Las Vegas Raiders. So Jacoby Myers, he is the number 1 wide receiver on this roster, and number 2 target in the passing game behind Bowers, in my opinion. And this week it's a good matchup versus Chicago Bears, where their secondary isn't all that great. But the thing is, we saw Trey Tucker emerge last week as a deep ball threat, and the guy could go out there and make big-time plays. So Myers, I don't think the ceiling is that high. And him and Geno Smith is still working on to get the rapport down. 26, Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs. So Xavier Worthy, he's been out the last 2 weeks with a shoulder injury. There's reports, it looks like he's going to return in week 4, but his snaps might be limited. But we saw the same thing with Emeka Egbuka as well in last week's game, where his snaps might be limited. And he went out there and he played a decent amount and got his number. So I think the same thing could happen with Worthy. And this week in a matchup versus Baltimore, this Kansas City Chiefs team needs all hands on deck. Worthy will return. It looked like last week he was going to return, and he practiced as well. So this week versus Baltimore, he could be that deep ball threat and consistent receiver that Mahomes needs right now in the offense. 27, Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So Brian Thomas Jr., what a bust he's been so far, first 3 weeks of the season. Last week, a big 47-yard catch, salvaged his day. He still finished under double-digit fantasy points in PPR leagues. And him and Trevor Lawrence, they're off. And also, it looks like he has a problem crossing the middle of the field and scared of contact a little bit, as Brian Thomas said. This week at San Francisco, it's a hard-hitting defense, even though we know Nick Bosa, their best defender's out for the season with the torn ACL. It's still a tough matchup. And like I said, the first 3 weeks, we've seen nothing from Thomas. So he's definitely dropped down in these rankings. 28, Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals. Another wide receiver. Week 1 had a good game, over 80 yards, found the end zone. In the last 2 weeks, he's failed to reach double-digit fantasy points. And last week as well, he dropped 2 passes, was Marvin Harrison Jr. So this week in a matchup with Tyrone Woolen, one of the better corners in the league, might be shadowing Marvin majority of the game. I don't think the upside is that big, even though we know Thursday Night Football, these are usually high-scoring games. 29, Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. He's been a touchdown-dependent wide receiver for the most part so far this season, but obviously off to a better start this year than he was last as Jalen Waddle. So this offense trying to work the kinks out. Week 1, they couldn't get anything going. Week 2, they put up points in New England. And then week 3 at Buffalo, it was a close game. And then obviously towards the end, Buffalo pulled away in one, but Waddle found the end zone. So this week in a matchup versus the Jets coming to town on Monday night where they can't stop anyone, I think Waddle's a good fringe 2 receiver / obviously a good number 3 wide receiver. 30, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. So last week he almost broke a big touchdown, got stopped at the 1, but now he's got a quadricep injury, and we don't know for sure if McLaurin's going to play in this game. But right now, going to have him on the list is scary, Terry. Like I said, the first 2 weeks he didn't have anything going, and not, like I said as well in other videos, anytime a guy holds out in training camp, it takes him a few weeks or even a month or two to get things going and get his legs back. But like I said, now with this quadricep injury, even if he plays, it's going to slow him down a little bit. And I just don't think the upside is there a lot for Terry McLaurin with Deebo Samuel in this offense this season, and Zach Ertz still a great option. 31, Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. So Chris Olave, the targets are there for him. Obviously, the ceiling hasn't been great for Chris Olave, but like I said, anytime you get targeted 10, 12 times a game and you're losing every ball game down a lot and you have to play catch-up all game long, you're going to work your way into fantasy points. And this week at Buffalo, definitely a tougher matchup. But like I said, it's most likely going to be the scenario where they're chasing points and he's going to work his way into volume and targets and putting up yards. 32, Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. So Devonta Smith last week had a breakout game in that one. And this Philadelphia Eagle team, when they got a pass, they're going to put up numbers. But this season so far, besides last week where they were down 3 scores versus the Rams, they were keeping it run first for the most part with Saquon Barkley and Jalen Hurts, and doing easier routes where they were playing it safe, throwing the football to Dallas Goedert a lot, where A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith the first 2 weeks of the season weren't really involved. So this week at Tampa, I think it's going to be a track meet. And these are the type of games where Devonta Smith puts up his numbers. 33, Juwan Jennings of the San Francisco 49ers. So it looks like there's a good shot Brock Purdy returns, where the original diagnosis was he was going to miss 3-4 weeks minimum was Purdy, but he's looking to get back in this one. This week, a good matchup with the Jaguars coming to town. And this offense, they've been playing pretty decent, but obviously if you could add Juwan Jennings back this week, it's a much added boost for Purdy as well. 34, Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. So Pittman, first 2 out of 3 weeks, he's put up numbers. And Daniel Jones, obviously, he's made this team better and offense more consistent and better the first 3 weeks of the season. Last season with Anthony Richardson and Joe Flacco, it just wasn't working at all for this Indianapolis Colts team. But now with a whole training camp and Daniel Jones winning the job pretty easily in training camp, this offense is way better and the results are shown, and it's paid dividends in terms of fantasy football for Pittman, Jonathan Taylor, and obviously Tyler Warren. So this week in a potential high-scoring game at the Rams, Pittman cracks the list. 35, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. So T. Higgins, his numbers are going to drop, obviously. He's had his best years with Joe Burrow in their quarterback. And a couple years ago when Jake Browning did fill in for Burrow, Higgins wasn't really putting up numbers. And the other thing with Higgins as well, he's been injury-prone throughout his career. With those two factors, and last week not doing much, and a tough matchup at Denver, I don't think Higgins has a high ceiling, obviously, like he did with Burrow in there. In the 36th and final receiver on rankings, DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. So DJ Moore last week found the end zone, or would have been 3 games to start the year with not scoring double-digit fantasy points. And I said it earlier, Rome Odunze is the number 1 option in this Bear offense. DJ Moore taking a little bit of a backseat. And even last season, I know he had 98 catches, but him and Caleb, for the most part, weren't on the same page. But this week, in a good matchup at the Vegas Raiders, I think Moore could be a decent flex number 3 receiver. So that's the top 36 receivers I'm ranking for week 4 of the fantasy football season.